Hey, folks, this is Charles Max Wood. I'm the CEO and general firefighter and fixer of things here at devchat.tv. And we've got a special deal for you. This episode was released a few months ago as episode 252, but it was super popular. People really loved it. And so we wanted to throw it back on the feed and give you something to listen to here. So definitely check it out. And I hope you enjoy it.
Hey everybody, and welcome to iPheaks, episode number 252. This week on our panel, we have Sadun.
Hello from Denver.
Jaim Zuber.
Hello from Minneapolis.
I'm Andrew Madsen in Salt Lake City. And we don't exactly have a special guest. We have our usual panelist, Gui Rambo, but he's going to be our guest this week. And Gui is going to talk about this new Siri stuff in iOS 12.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
So Guy, why don't you just give us a really high-level 30,000-foot overview of what is new with Siri in iOS 12? A lot of our listeners probably already know most of this stuff, but I think it'd be good to recap.
Yeah, so on iOS 12, apps can now define their own intents for Siri. Before, you could only use Siri for your app if you had a very specific domain like messaging or list taking, note taking, or ride sharing and other domains like that. But now we can actually use Siri for other types of apps that do not necessarily fit inside those very narrow domains.
I need to haul you back just about 2 feet. You mentioned a Siri intention. This is like complications on the watch. Could you explain what an intention is?
So they call it they call them intents, and they are basically ways for you to define an action that a user wants to take in a certain context. And for our purposes here, the context is the app. So if your app is a note-taking app, you're going to have a write a note intent, and the intent will be to write a note, so create a new note, and you will probably have a text that you want to add to the note. So that's an example that would be possible even before iOS 12, but with iOS 12, you can create your own intents with their own inputs and outputs.
So a year or so ago, you could create a nest intent. What kind of additional semantics can you now introduce using Siri?
Basically anything. You define your intent using Xcode with the intent editor, and they have some templates for common things such as purchases and other common actions that people might want to take in an app, such as creating an item, and the item can be any arbitrary item that's applicable to your app. But you can actually just use a template that's called the run template, which basically means do anything. So your intent can be basically any action that a user can take inside your app.
I want to dig into this a lot more because there's some really cool stuff here, but I also want to know what else is new with Siri in iOS 12.
Well, one thing that's really cool is that we can now use the NS User Activity API, which we've been using for stuff like handoff and continuity. We can now use the same API to provide information to the Siri knowledge system They don't call that publicly, but I like to do that distinction because Siri now is not just a personal voice assistant. It's more than that. So Siri is this entire system on iOS and the Mac and the Watch that can give you contextual suggestions based on the location you are, the time of the day, the calendar events even, and many other inputs. So you can now use the NS user activity system to provide information for the system that this Siri knowledge system will learn and eventually give suggestions to the user. Those can be in the form of suggestions in the Siri, in the Spotlight interface, and they can also be suggestions even in the lock screen if they are really relevant.
That's really cool. Apple's been doing that kind of stuff with their own apps for a while. Like if I plug my iPhone into my car, it suggests Overcast to me, because usually when I get in my car and plug in my phone, I open Overcast and start listening to a podcast. But it's no more detailed than that. It's just, here's this app you use. It doesn't know anything about the app, the content of the app or parts of the app. So that's pretty cool. What about Siri shortcuts? Is that something different than custom intents?
Those shortcuts, they are based on intents, and they can also be based on user activity items. So you can think of custom intents as a more advanced user activity object. It's because you can basically do very similar things with them, but with intents, you get a little bit more flexibility as to the formats and how they're presented, and you can use custom extensions to have the intents be executed outside of your app, which we can talk about later. So the Siri shortcuts, they are just a way for the user to record a custom trigger phrase that will then execute an intent or just open a user activity in your app.
Well, let's start. What's the easiest way for a developer to add support for some new Siri feature in iOS 12?
The easiest way is definitely user activity. So if you're already supporting things such as Spotlight indexing, and if you're already supporting things like handoff, if you do the custom URL stuff, which uses user activity, you can adopt the Siri shortcuts and the suggestions functionality just by setting a Boolean property on your user activity object, which is called is eligible for prediction. So if you enable that on your user activity, and it's only available on iOS 12, you can just set that property and the system will consume that user activity as a means of predicting a future useful action for the user. And it's important that you don't do that for basically every user activity in your app. It must be something that the user will want to do repeatedly, such as messaging a friend, for instance. That's a good example. I will probably want to message friends multiple times, and there's no expiration to that unless, I guess, I'm not a friend with that person anymore. But you should only use it for things that are repeatable. So not like a one-time thing that the user does once in your app and never does again. Let's give a practical example. If you have an e-commerce app and it has many products, every time the user opens up the screen of a specific product inside the app, you might want to create a user activity for that item and provide it to the prediction system, because the user might want to open the app again later to see the same products. And if it's like a food ordering app, which the user might open every Friday night to order some specific flavor of pizza, you will probably see that being suggested to the user if that's something that's done with a certain frequency and at specific times and locations. So that's a very easy way to get started, and user activity is a very simple API.
Okay, so if you have an e-commerce app, probably selling a TV is not a good activity for this to create an intent, because you're not going to buy that many TVs. But if you like the same coffee you get every week, that type of thing is repeatable. That's something that you could give to the system, to Siri, multiple times, and they could figure out that, oh, whatever's happening has happened before, and this is when they usually order their coffee. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's basically the perfect example. Let's say I order the same coffee every Monday morning at 8. The system will learn that very quickly, and I'll be very soon seeing that coffee suggested on my lock screen or in Spotlight, because the system will associate that specific day of the week and specific time with that activity.
What other things does it use to create the recommendation? You talked about time, the dates. What other factors are in use?
Apple won't say exactly all of the variables involved. I guess it's a little bit like the Google algorithm. They don't want people trying to game the system or something. But we know that it uses at least the day of the week, the time, and also the location. But it's probably also using the previous actions you've executed, and it probably associates different actions. So if you do a sequence of actions, it might associate those actions together. And it probably also uses connected accessories, like Andrew mentioned.
So Siri is notable for not just doing simple single commands like, Siri, do you love me? And Siri will say, well, I'm modestly fond of you. But you can also say, send a text. To whom? What should I have the text say? And so forth. Does this kind of flexibility and story flow apply to the developer APIs as well as to the built-in? Or is this something that you have to give a command that's a complete command all at once?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's still not a possibility with the custom intents. You can't get customized inputs. Going back to our example of the e-commerce, if I want to purchase a specific type of coffee and I want one item and I want it delivered to my home, when I register that intent with Siri, I'm going to register the purchase of that type of coffee with one item and to my home, and I can't change that using Siri. So I'll always be ordering that specific order. But what you can do is you can specify combinations of parameters that your intent supports, and you can decide which combinations are complete. So I need probably the type of coffee and the number of items and delivery location. So I need all three of them. And if one of those is not specified, I can then open my app and let the user just specify that one thing that's missing. But I can't do that through Siri. That's the main limitation of custom intents at the moment, is that you can't provide custom inputs using Siri.
This episode is sponsored by GitLab Commit. GitLab's inaugural user event brings together the GitLab community to connect, learn, and inspire. Speakers will showcase the power of DevOps in action through strategy and technology decisions, lessons learned, behind-the-scenes looks at the development lifecycle, and more. Learn how to innovate the future of software development by registering today. GitLab Commit Brooklyn, September 17th, and GitLab Commit London, October 9th. You can find it at devchat.tv/GitLab Commit.
Let me follow on to that by asking, what kind of output can you create? Because when you ask Siri, you can ask it to show you pictures of kittens, and you'll see that in the chat. Or you can ask for a random number, and it will show you a random number. And sometimes it will speak it aloud. Sometimes it will say, here's what I found. What kind of feedback do you get from custom intents?
The feedback will depend on the type of intent and also how you implement it. So the most simple implementation is you just create your intent and let the app handle it. So when the user invokes your intent, either through Siri or through the Sharecuts app or any other means, it's going to just launch your app and you're going to get a callback on your app delegate, very similar to how you get a callback when the user opens a deep link. So that's like the easiest way. So the output is basically launching your app in that specific screen and doing that specific action. If you want to do something more advanced, you can implement a Siri intent handling extension. So that's something that will be run in the background. And that type of extension can provide output to Siri in the form of text. So it's going to be just a message like, okay, your order is complete, or sorry, there was an error. Do you want to open the app? Something like that. And if you want to do even more, you can create your custom intent UI extension. And that type of extension can actually provide custom UI that's displayed in the context of the Siri UI. And it can also be displayed in a notification looking thing that opens up when you 3D touch an item in the Spotlight interface, or you 3D touch it in the lock screen. So you can choose which level of quality of output you want to implement. And the most advanced one is the UI extension that can be pretty much anything you want in terms of UI. You have some space limitations and some interactivity limitations. But if you want to display the picture of a kitten, you can definitely do that.
So how much power do you have to handle automatic things? Like if you're ordering a coffee or a television and just handling it automatically, like, can you just do that in the app, charge money?
Yeah.
That's what you can do?
Yeah, so the sample I gave for a talk I presented on the subject is a milkshake ordering app. And the sample app supports Apple Pay. So in that case, since it does everything through Apple Pay, you can actually implement the entire Apple Pay purchasing flow inside of your extension. And when you do like the sample I did is order hot caramel sundae, it's going to show a preview of the products, which is my custom UI extension. And you just say yes. It opens up the Apple Pay sheet inside of the Siri UI. You confirm the payment with Face ID or Touch ID, and it does the entire ordering process without even launching the app. So you can do that. If your app needed to get like credit card details, you'd have to open the app at least once, assuming you could save that information later for further purchases. So yeah, you can do quite a lot using the background extension.
It seems like there are really two parts to Siri that Apple uses. So Apple uses Siri to describe the voice assistant thing that you talk to and hear from, but they actually also use Siri for I don't know how to term this, but the stuff on the suggestions on the lock screen and the things that are on the Spotlight screen and that sort of thing. I don't think the average user though thinks of any of that as Siri. They think of Siri as the thing you talk to. How much of what we've been talking about applies to Siri, the voice assistant, versus Siri, the lock screen and notification drawer suggestion assistant?
Pretty much everything we talked about applies to both. So there's no distinction. There's even, I think we should mention the Sharecuts app. If you have a custom intent or even a user activity, you can use that as part of the Sharecuts app. So you can create a shortcut in the Sharecuts app and you can integrate actions of your app inside a sequence of shortcuts and events you execute. And the same flow will be applied to all of the different invocation methods. In the case of the milkshake app I built, if you touch the item in the spotlight suggestion, it's going to open up the UI I made using the UI extension, just like it would open up in the Siri UI. So you don't have any distinction as to how the user is invocating your shortcuts. It's going to behave the same independently of how it's being executed.
I want to take this off to left field and ask you, why don't we have these same strengths and APIs and just nuance on the Mac, which has Siri, that we get on iOS?
That's something you should ask Apple. I guess it's because...
Yeah, but you're the person who actually looks at, the Mac and stuff under the hood. Do you see any hints that this kind of thing would be there? I mean, as a Mac author, I would love to be able to do things that are really exciting with Siri with my app on the Macintosh. But right now, I don't think I've used Siri more than twice since it's launched on the Mac. And that's been some time.
Yeah, currently, the only thing you can do really with third-party apps and Siri on the Mac is if the app has user activity support, you can, with the app active, you can say to Siri, remind me about this tomorrow at 10 a.m. And it's going to grab the user activity from the active app and add that to a reminder. So that's basically the entire extent of third-party Siri integration on the Mac. If you want to try it out, you can try it in something like Mail or using my WWDC app for Mac. If you have a session selected in the app, you can say, remind me about this, and it's going to detect the user activity and give you a reminder later. But that's all you can do at the moment. And I think it's because, first of all, there are still different operating systems, even though the underlying technologies are the same. There are still many differences under the hood. And with Project Marzipan, which we got a sneak peek earlier this year, I think they don't want people to be building all of these extensions with the Mac APIs only to then release the APIs exactly the same as they are on iOS next year, and then have to keep supporting both. So I guess it's a waiting game now. It's just a matter of time until we can run the same extensions on both the Mac and iOS.
It's frustrating though, because I sit in front of my Mac all day, every day, and Siri could be really useful, but it's not on the Mac.
Yeah, it's interesting that with Shortcuts, which was previously Workflow, I've been playing around with that a lot lately, and there are some things you can do more easily and some very powerful things you can do with Shortcuts that you simply can't do with your Mac, at least not as easily.
Yeah, I mean, Automator has been on the Mac for a long time and AppleScript for even longer. And I don't know. I actually use AppleScript all the time on the Mac, and it would be nice to be able to tie that into Siri. So, I have something that I don't know very much about, but I wanted to ask you about. I noticed that along with the support for new intents, for custom intents in iOS 12, there's actually a resource file format for defining intents. The editor for it in Xcode looks kind of like the core data editor a little bit. What's that all about?
So that's how you actually make your custom intents, and you define properties and responses and enums for your custom intent. So the first thing you do is you can select a category, and they have different categories, and those will inform how Siri will behave in relation to your intent. So there are generic ones, like I mentioned, do, run, and go. There are informational, there are ordering, there are start, share, create, search, downloads, and others that you can choose. So that's just like a configuration for how it's going to behave. You can give them titles, descriptions, images, and configure several parameters, such as whether they can be executed in the background or if they must open your app in order to execute. And what that UI is doing is basically generating code for you. So it will actually generate classes for your intents that you define in that UI. And those classes you're going to instantiate in code and give to the system for Siri shortcuts and the Siri knowledge system to learn about them.
I think the biggest problem with Siri intents is going to be training people to use it and having that issue of discoverability and training. Because unless the app is advocating and teaching its users, and it's got to do this some way in terms of taking over the field of view and bringing this information to the user in some way that's really not obnoxious, I don't think people are going to use custom intents. You need to have that training be part of it, because nobody's going to discover the fact that you can say, show my personal contact QR code in my friend's app, because that's really hard to say. There has to be simplicity of expression, but you also sort of have to be able to include the name of the app correctly, and you have to be able to create statements that work with Siri's parser. And how do you see apps succeeding with this, and where do you see apps failing?
Yeah, I feel like the main issue, as you mentioned, will be the discoverability aspect of it. And I think apps can do something to help with that. Apple has provided a view controller that you can use, which is actually the entire add to Siri interface that you can access from preferences on iOS 12. So if you open up the settings app on iOS 12 and you go to Siri and search, there's a section called Siri Shortcuts, and it's going to show you suggested shortcuts. So send a message to so-and-so and play this playlist. And when you tap the plus button, it opens up an add to Siri interface where you can record your custom trigger phrase for that action. And that entire add to Siri UI is available to the apps. So the user doesn't have to actually go into settings and open up that panel, which, as you mentioned, many people won't know about its existence. So you can basically, when the user has done an action, let's say the user has just finished ordering a coffee, you can show a button that says add to Siri. And when the user taps the button, it's going to open up the add to Siri interface. And then they can create a custom phrase, which, as you mentioned, must be something simple, such as coffee time or something like that, or caffeine. So it can be just a simple word. I feel like the discoverability aspect is going to be interesting, and I'm very curious to see how different apps are going to handle that, how much the apps are going to push users into adding stuff to Siri. I feel like if it's well implemented in the app, it can be a way to drive more engagement from the users. But yeah, it's a big question mark there, how much it's going to get adoption.
Then let me ask you a related question. And that is, we've had extensions now for several years. And extensions are also very much an opt-in, opt-out sort of system. Have developers found that this is in their bottom line best interest to support these extensions and have users that have to be trained to find them and to use them, because there's a big monetary investment. So are we seeing that kind of thing be a success, or have we seen an initial response to it and then developers pulling back?
I feel like the types of extensions that work the best are the ones that don't require too much stuff from the user. So as an example, I feel like the notification extensions, they have a decent amount of adoption, and they provide some very useful functionality to apps in terms of customizing the notification interface and handling rich notifications with pictures and stuff. So I feel like those have succeeded. The Today extensions, not so much. It depends on the type of app you're using. The one I use the most is the one for Carrots, which is my favorite weather app. So that one I use a lot, and I very rarely actually run the app. I just look at the Today extension to see the forecast. In the case of the Siri extension, like I said, it's a question mark. It does require some effort from the user, but I feel like it's less than a Today extension requires, because Today extensions are really tricky. You have to tell the user to open up the notification center and find the add button and then drag your card into the specific place. So it's a little more tricky than just pressing an add to Siri button and saying something. So I feel like there's a good chance that they are going to get more adoption than Today extensions. And I should also mention that handling Siri shortcuts does not require an extension. You can provide a better user experience with extensions, but you don't have to have extensions.
Is there a place to watch your talk that you gave? Is it online?
It is, but it's in Portuguese, so I think it's a little tricky for people to watch.
Oh, was the conference in Brazil?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I didn't know there was a iOS conference in Brazil.
It's actually a huge conference. It's called the Developers Conference, and it has many different tracks for all sorts of technologies, and iOS is one of them, and it's actually one of the small ones because, there aren't that many iOS developers here.
I'm looking at it right now. It really does have a lot of tracks.
Yeah.
How many people go to this?
I have no idea, but it definitely, I would say in the tens of thousands, if you take into account all the different days and the different tracks. But the iOS track is usually like at most 100 people.
Interesting. Well, I think that's kind of fun because you can actually meet people and see who's there and whatever.
Yeah, I've met some really good friends in that conference.
Developers are people just like us, and a lot of times they have really, really interesting stories about how they got into a programming language, out of a programming language, how they got into programming in the first place. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that have a degree in music or have some affinity for music, or maybe they have a degree in something else like theater, and then they wound up getting into programming for other reasons. I actually used to work with a whole team of people that all had law degrees that wrote code. It's just interesting to me how people have come along in their careers as developers. So we have a show for you. So if you're into Ruby, go check out My Ruby Story. That's at myrubystory.com.
What else should we know about Siri in iOS 12 that we haven't talked about?
I think we should mention the Sharecuts app, which is coming with iOS 12. So the Sharecuts app, if people are familiar with the workflow app, Sharecuts is basically workflow. It's the same team, but they have renamed it to Sharecuts, which is a more friendly name. And it's going to be in the App Store, so it's not a platform app. It doesn't come pre-installed with iOS 12. So if you are interested in creating combinations of actions to run together, you will have to go to the App Store and download the Sharecuts app. It's going to replace the workflow app when iOS 12 ships. So if you have the workflow app, it's probably going to be an update that's going to rename it to Sharecuts. It is compatible with the old workflows you have from the workflow app, and it runs on iOS 10 and later. So it's not an iOS 12 specific thing. But if you want to use all of the custom intents and user activity and Siri functionality, you of course have to be running iOS 12. So what you can do with shortcuts is you can string together several different actions, and then you can just save that collection of actions as a shortcut that can be executed either inside the app itself with their today extension or through a Siri shortcut. So you can record a custom phrase and use that as a Siri shortcut. And the custom intents and user activities that third-party apps provide can be integrated into a custom shortcut. As with the Siri invocation, they don't take any input, so you can't customize the inputs that way, but you can like create a shortcut that changes the lights in your home and tells you the estimated time of arrival if you're leaving work, and orders your favorite coffee from a single action. So that's pretty cool. And Shortcuts is very powerful. You can do some programmery things with it, like downloading something from the web and parsing JSON and grabbing keys and values from the JSON and transforming them. So it's basically like a mini programming language that you build with building blocks.
I know that the Shortcuts app really is workflow. They bought workflow and hired the team, and they did not scrap the app and rewrite it or anything. It is the workflow.
I've looked into it, and it's all WK something in the prefixes. It's also using the same bundle identifier, which is funny. It's not com.apple.shortcuts. It's is.workflow.app, something like that.
Yeah, it says Apple is the owner, but if you go to the website is the original website.
Yeah, it's still up, and I've seen even some evidence that they are going to bring back the old workflow sync service. It's going to be compatible with the Shortcuts app, so it's definitely still workflow. I guess they didn't want to get the old-time workflow users pissed because they destroyed their app. So they made lots of effort into keeping the app compatible and just improving it.
If they're using types that start with WK, they're doing it in Objective-C. Once again, proving Andrew's point that Objective-C is the solution for everything on Mac.
Well,
or on iOS too.
I must tell you the news. They are actually using Swift for the at least the newer parts, the new UI implementation.
Oh,
that's
thank goodness for that.
And they use Realm as well, which is funny for an Apple app. So they didn't migrate to core data.
I mean, I think the app is old enough that they've got code in Objective-C. I actually briefly talked to a member of the team when I was in San Jose. I think this acquisition was really a best case scenario for a team like that. There are a bunch of iOS developers that really care about what they're making, have made an app that people love, and especially power users love.
And it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's an Apple Design Award winner. And Apple hires, instead of Sherlocking them, Apple hires them, and they don't say you have to throw away everything that made your app great. They say, we want to just make it better and integrate it with the system and make it a tentpole feature of this new release. And so they've got to be pretty happy. But I wonder how much of keeping workflow or keeping the Shortcuts app the same as workflow and keeping the features that made people love it was, sort of due to the people on the team insisting on that.
Yeah, I mentioned it during a Stack Trace episode that I feel like it could even be like a something in the contract when they purchased when they acquired Workflow that like we are going to keep the code base and keep the functionality. And it's great because now since they are inside Apple, they can use private APIs and they can use private entitlements even. So now you can control do not disturb airplane modes. You can run arbitrary JavaScript in Safari using shortcuts. So the app has gotten a lot more powerful.
I've never been shy about stating how much I dislike the iOS 7 design language redesign. And I look at Workflow, and it is just so visually gorgeous. And the colors are bright. And I just hope that maybe they take it from there and expand it to the rest of the operating system.
Yeah, I love the bright colors and the gradients, and it looks really pretty.
We love Johnny Ive, but he's been locked into that white room for way too long.
Yeah, I love his hardware, but I think I actually like the software UIs before he got in charge of them.
I don't want to defend felt and leather and grommets, but I really wish they had taken more time and more thought in where they wanted to take the UI, because I just feel that iOS 7 kind of let the platform down a little. Yeah,
it's kind of sad. Well, if there's nothing else about Siri, let's get to the picks. Jaim, do you have a pick for us?
Sure, I've got a pick today. So in the past, we've talked about eagle feeds and random nature feeds. I'm not sure what else we've talked about. Something came across my desk today, the other day. Bears in National Park in Alaska. Brown bears are fishing off salmon, and they've got cameras out there 24 hours a day. So if it's 2 a.m., it's still pretty light out there. So you can still see bears hanging out doing whatever they're doing. It's a lot of fun. There's lots of happening. And if by the time you're listening to this, it's past whatever that season is where the salmon are running, they've got YouTube, stuff like that. But it's pretty entertaining. So bear cam, and you can see bears chasing after fish, bears fighting each other to get to the fish, families of bears getting into it. So lots of fun. Check out the bear cam from Katmai National Park.
I need this. I need this yesterday.
I need an app that turns this into my wallpaper on my Mac.
The live stream wallpaper. I like it.
Because, now that the salmon aren't running, we've lost our main entertainment. And of course, the volcano, eventually burned up the live cams on the cameras. I need some bear.
Well, I've got a link for you.
Fantastic.
Erica, do you have a pick for us?
I do. And my pick is the iPhone original. And the reason it's my pick this week is that because of all sorts of weird circumstances involving taking my 6 Plus over to Apple for their battery program, because I'd really like to get that done. We're running out of time. There are only a few more months left in this. I'm going to have to hand over my device, possibly for several days. They said they're not entirely sure if they have the parts on hand and so forth, which means I need a device to use in the meantime. So I took out some old devices, plugged them in, and I found that my iPhone original, the 4 gigabyte one, and my iPhone 4S, they both charged, came to life. It was beautiful and so forth. And before I could really test whether or not it worked with AT&T's SIM cards, I needed to see if the batteries were still pretty good. And so I charged them all up, and then I just left them out, on the counter. And by that evening, they were both still at 100%. After 24 hours, the iPhone original was still at about 100%. The iPhone 4S was about at 40%. And at that point, I did some research. I realized I probably couldn't use my SIM, so I threw it in a box. 24 hours later, I take it out just to take a quick look at it, and I realize this thing is still at nearly 100%. And we're now on, I think, day 3 of this, and that baby's still charged. And this device is from 2007, they delivered it in 2007, I think. And it's working, and its battery is incredible. We would never get this on a more recent iPhone.
Yeah, I wonder what's up with this. I've got 2 original iPhones, and they're the same way. They will hold a charge for a long, long time.
I think it was
cool.
Steve.
So AT&T shut off their 2G service.
Yeah, I did try sticking in a SIM. Not only did they shut off the 2G service, but theoretically I should be able to connect. But iTunes will. It eventually. I did boot into last night into. It wasn't Mavericks because Mavericks wouldn't boot. I booted into Yosemite, and Yosemite, authorized it, unlocked it, and so forth, and activated the device. But the device will not connect to any AT&T towers.
What's even more fascinating is that if you open up like the App Store, it still works.
Yep. I opened up the Stocks app to see if it would correctly handle the $1 trillion market cap when Apple hit it a couple weeks ago. Worked fine. All right. Thanks for your pick. Guy, do you have a pick for us?
I'm going to pick a project of mine, which is Sharecuts. So with Shortcuts, people were talking about how it would be cool to have an open community to share their shortcuts. And so I built Sharecuts. It's at Sharecuts.app, and it's a website where you can find some cool shortcuts. And if you open it up on your iOS device with the Shortcuts app installed, you can just tap a shortcut in there, and it's going to launch the Shortcuts app and download the shortcut to your library. And it's going to get a lot better. It's invite only for uploads so far. I'm working with some people to get a new front-end design for it, and it's going to be improving a lot in the coming months. So that's my pick, Sharecuts.app.
Great, thanks. I have, I just got back from a road trip. Well, actually 2 road trips, which is kind of weird, but I went to Portland a little over a week ago, and so I'm going to pick an ice cream shop in Portland, and it's called 50 Licks. I think there are a few well-known ice cream stores in Portland. I just hit into this one walking down the street and got ice cream from it, and it was really good. So if you're in Portland and haven't been there, or if you find yourself in Portland down the road, check this place out, 50 Licks. I think they have 2 locations. Their ice cream is kind of interesting flavors, but nothing too weird. There are some ice cream shops that have really weird flavors now, but this is like unusual, but still normal. Like caramelized honey was one of the ones I got. And it was
that sounds lovely. Do you remember any of the others?
I got banana pudding. They had blood orange creamsicle, some sort of lavender. I can't remember what it was, but it actually had lavender in the ice cream. I'm trying to remember. French toast, I think, was one of them. I didn't get all these flavors. I got 2.
I looked them up. They have cornbread with honey butter ice cream. Wouldn't you just love to try that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
And blackstrap ginger snap.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I want to.
All right, next week's show from Portland. We agreed?
I'm up for it.
Oh, and coconut lemon saffron.
Yeah, it was good stuff. So anyway, check it out, 50 Licks. Well, I think that's our show for this week. Thanks for all of the information, Guy. It was great to learn more about Siri and iOS 12.
Thanks.
See everybody next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.